Welcome to Frasier on Film, the Frasier TV show podcast with a twist. Each episode of the podcast visits each episode of Frasier across its 11-series run. But our main focus isn't on the good doctor himself, no. It's going to be one of the guest appearances on the show that week. That could be one of the many A-listers who called into Frasier's KACL radio show, or just someone who made a fleeting appearance at Cafe Nervosa. We'll delve into that actor's backstory, look over their cinematic offerings, and deep dive into one movie specifically. By the end, we'll see if we can make a connection between their character in Frasier and their character in the film we've just talked about. So you'll be hearing about icons and wash-ups, legends and starlets, sherry drinkers and beer guzzlers, blockbusters and B-movies. It's going to be an education in it all. But what if you don't really watch Frasier? That's fine, you'll probably know the actors we're talking about. And if you don't really know the actors we're talking about, then that's fine too. You'll know the movies. So whether you're a fan of Frasier or you're a fan of film, this is the podcast for you. So, pull up your favourite bar stool at McGinty's and tell the wine club you'll be running late, because this is Frasier on Film, and I'm your host, Ben Murray, and you're listening. What if Sideshow Bob was challenged to a fight by Fat Tony? Well, that's what pretty much happens in Season 1, Episode 4 of both Frasier on Film and of Frasier itself. Yes, welcome back. Today's episode of Frasier is entitled I Hate Frasier Crane, and our guest actor for the week has his fingerprints all over the episode. Joe Mantegna. He plays newspaper columnist Derek Mann, never seen on screen, but someone who, as the episode title suggests, hates Frasier Crane. We'll be exploring Mantegna's backstory, of course, as always, and then locking in and focusing on one of his cinematic offerings today. That film will be Homicide. Homicide. David Mamet. A man I like. Spoke about him last week as well. Of course, Mantegna is known for countless roles in mafia films. He just has that look and that voice, which is largely down, I think, to his voice acting as Fat Tony in The Simpsons, of course. But we'll get to all that. We'll get to it. Let's find out why he wants to fight Frasier first, as we recap this week's episode.
Apparently, Mr. Mann heard your program yesterday.
So I see. Yesterday afternoon, Dr. Frasier Crane got on my case for not giving him a point-by-point criticism of his radio show. Well, he asked for it, so here goes.
Oh, my God. His entire column is about your show.
Not very flattering, either. Toward the end, he even attacks your dim-witted sidekick call screener.
That's me.
Oh, now I remember you.
Season 1, Episode 4. Episode title, I Hate Frasier Crane. Air date, 7th October 1993, written by Christopher Lloyd and directed by David Lee. We open up with Eddie staring at Frasier as he plays the piano. Our lovely staring Eddie. Martin is at the dining table. He's working on an old case that's been haunting him and been troubling him for a while. This case will carry on through, if not a few seasons, a few episodes at least. It's the Weeping Lotus murder. It now feels like Martin is truly at home. He's relaxing at the table, doing this, getting all his paperwork out. This is his home now. Niles arrives and continues tripping over his tongue with Daphne. They all sit down for dinner, and Martin says grace. And meanwhile, Niles is staring longingly at Daphne, and Eddie is staring intensely at Frasier. Frasier shouts out, "Oh, will you stop staring?" And Niles shouts out, "I wasn't staring." Very funny laughs. Niles reaches into his bag. He brings out a newspaper and shows Derek Mann's column in it entitled I Hate Frasier Crane. That's it. No content. No additional content. This very much gets up Frasier's nose. So much so that he calls out Derek Mann on his radio show the next day, which leads, of course, to Mann publishing a follow-up with a blow-by-blow outline of the reasons why he hates Frasier Crane. Interestingly, a lot of the reasons he gives for hating Frasier are the reasons I and countless others love the character of Frasier Crane. At Cafe Nervosa, we get an appearance by a waiter. He has one line, then he walks off. Pay attention to this guy, because he might just be reappearing this season on the Frasier on Film podcast as the man in the spotlight. More on him to come. Frasier takes Derek Mann again to task on his show, very angrily this time, causing Derek Mann to call in. That's Joe Mantegna's appearance. We'll play a clip of that call at the end of this. He challenges Frasier to a fight. Frasier's pressurized. He goes ahead with it. But when he gets home, Martin, who's overly proud of him, finds out Frasier just said yes to placate Derek Mann. Martin's let down. You gave him your word, he says. And he says it's like Billy Kriesel and your clarinet lessons all over again. This wounds Frasier because Billy Kriesel was his childhood bully. And the clarinet lessons was an excuse he used to use to get out of fighting Billy Kriesel.
I am an adult now. I have been to medical school. I hold a certain position in this city. I do not settle my differences with brawling.
The man challenged you, you accepted.
Dad, I don't believe this. You won't be happy until I come home with a black eye.
I just want you to do what you said you were going to do. You know, you can talk about your medical school, your intellect, your place in this city. But you know what? It's all one big clarinet lesson.
So hurt by his words, Frasier actually turns up at Cafe Nervosa the following day, ready to fight Derek Mann. We haven't seen him, remember? We just hear this voice. Roz is there. She says, look at the size of him. She can see Derek Mann outside the window. Niles is there. Even a mariachi band is there. Martin and Daphne arrive. Everyone turns up for this fight. A lot of bloodlust in this episode of Frasier. But Martin apologises for giving Frasier a hard time, but tells him he's proud of him for going ahead. But just as he is about to take on Derek Mann, the police arrive to break up the fight, and we discover that it was Martin who called the cops to ensure his son wouldn't have to face the inevitable blows he would get. So here's some trivia on the episode. While Frasier and Martin are discussing him backing out of the fight, and Martin says it's similar to the Billy Kriesel childhood, Billy Kriesel would appear on the show in season 2 in the episode Seat of Power. So look out for him when he comes. As mentioned in the preamble for this episode, Kelsey Grammer and Joe Mantegna both play long-running recurring characters on The Simpsons. Grammer, of course, playing Sideshow Bob, Bart's arch-enemy, and Mantegna playing the Springfield Mafia boss, Fat Tony. Interestingly, and we should probably point it out now, since we're talking about Sideshow Bob, there are 2 episodes in which David Hyde Pierce and John Mahoney appear as relatives of Sideshow Bob. In Simpsons, I mean. So there's one where David Hyde Pierce turns up as Sideshow Bob's brother, Cecil. And there's even a mention to Maris in that episode. John Mahoney appears in an episode as Bob Terwilliger Sr. Let's bring our focus back to the man of the moment, Joe Mantegna, Fat Tony. Here he is, calling in to Frasier's show as Derek Mann.
This is Dr. Frasier Crane. I'm listening.
Good, because I was listening too.
And you are?
Derek Mann.
I see.
Look, nobody calls me half a man, especially some Ivy League twit. So what do you say we settle this? Like men.
Are you implying that you want to fight me?
I'm not implying it. I'm saying it.
Fight as in a fist fight?
No, I thought we might throw pies at each other. So, are you up to it? Or aren't you man enough?
So, Mr. Joe Mantegna, born 13th November 1947 in Chicago to Italian and Sicilian parents, as if you couldn't guess. Though his father was disabled for most of his life and would pass away in 1971 due to tuberculosis, his mother would go on to live to 101. Growing up in and around Chicago, he got a taste for the creative life by playing bass in a band called the Apocryphals. The Apocryphals would never hit the big time, but they did perform alongside another local group who would go on to find worldwide acclaim. That group, Chicago. Very famous for, if you leave me now, you take away the greatest part of me. Mantegna apparently remains very close friends with the original band members to this day. Now, unlike most of our previous guests, Mantegna did not attend Juilliard. He's bucking the system. Instead, he studied at the Goodman School of Drama and the Art Institute of Chicago. Renegade that he is, however, he left right before graduating in 1969. But nevertheless, as with many of our guest actors, he took to the stage long before he appeared on screen. At the age of 22, he starred in the musical Hair, and it would be the beginning of a long and varied relationship with the theatre. He would go on to write, direct, and star in some of his own productions over the many years that followed. But his most valuable theatrical connection, and most interesting to me on a personal level, is and was his relationship with playwright David Mamet. Now, I've spoken about Mamet before. I spoke about it at the beginning of the episode. We spoke about Mamet last week on the Patti LuPone episode. Well, Mantegna's relationship with Mamet takes it up a notch. Not only did he star in Broadway versions of Mamet's A Life in the Theatre, The Disappearance of the Jews, and Speed the Plough, he would also, now listen close, he would also win a Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Play for his portrayal of Richard Romer in the 1984 original production of Mamet's Pulitzer-winning Glengarry Glen Ross. Glengarry Glen Ross is my favourite film of all time, depending on which day of the week you ask me. So I'm very thrilled that 4 episodes in I'm getting the chance to shout about it. Pacino would go on to embody Romer for me when the film adaptation was made in 1992, but I would have loved to have seen Mantegna tackle the role. Mantegna's relationship with Mamet extended beyond the stage though. He'd also go on to appear in several Mamet films, including House of Games, Things Change, Red Belt, and today's movie of choice, Homicide. But how did Mantegna get into the movies? Well, supposedly he started off as a photographer, just taking headshots for industry folk. But before he'd make his feature film debut in 1977's Medusa Challenger, he'd actually have to encounter some significant changes in his personal life. I already touched on the death of his father. That took place in 1971, but also a few years later in 1975, he would marry his wife, Arlene, to whom he's still married to this day. Medusa Challenger paved the way for an assortment of on-screen appearances, from television to film. His ongoing collaboration with Mamet on screen has been spoken of, and dominated the majority of his career in the late 80s by the looks of it. But his real significant big break in Hollywood came when he was cast as the treacherous mob boss Joey Zasa in The Godfather Part 3.
I was picking up some linguine from the local Italian restaurant around the corner when I walked in, and I knew I was being considered for a role in the movie. I mean, I did this, I knew. But that's all I knew. It was like, yeah, you're under consideration. And I walk in to pick it up, and the owner of the restaurant goes, Joe Mantegna, you son of a gun, you're going to be in a Godfather movie. I go, what? He goes, you're going to be in a Godfather movie. What are you kidding? You come on.
Personally, I think the film is criminally overlooked. For the longest time, I had actually convinced myself it was better than Part 2. Zasa is an absolute highlight in the film, but he's almost certainly responsible for the wrong assumption that Mantegna, mainly famous for playing mafia men. Indeed, the beginning of this episode, I suggested Mantegna had a long and checkered career playing mafia men. He actually hasn't. It's no coincidence that immediately following the release of The Godfather Part 3 then, that the creators of The Simpsons would come knocking. They had a part that they thought Mantegna would be perfect for, a one-time appearance as mob boss Fat Tony. Now, Mantegna was sure they wanted him to just perform the role like Joey Zasa, but he didn't want to conflate the two performances. So instead, he modelled the voice of Fat Tony on his uncle, Willie. The character of Fat Tony proved so popular that he remains on the show to this day. Mantegna's favourite episode still remains his debut one, the one where Bart begins running errands for the mob. A year after the release of Godfather Part 3, Mantegna would return to the big screen in Mamet's Homicide, but we'll talk about that shortly. The following years and decades would see Mantegna split between comedic films and TV shows, including Airheads, Baby's Day Out, Frasier of course, and Saturday Night Live.
Hi, I'm Joe Mantegna.
Oh yeah, and Vanilla Ice.
Join us on Saturday Night Live because I can't imagine any other place where you can see the two of us together.
Yep.
Arguably his most well-known role of the 21st century is his 18-year stint on the TV show Criminal Minds. Now, I've not seen it. I understand it's very popular if you're into that kind of FBI episodic series. He's even directed several episodes of the show. It's bringing him steady work. He's remaining fully in the game. No immediate thoughts of retirement, so more power to him. During his stint on the show, he actually received his Hollywood Walk of Fame star, and he requested his star be as close to his idol Errol Flynn as possible. Away from the screen, Mantegna has won plaudits for his efforts raising awareness and funds for autism. His second daughter Mia was born with autism, and he's appeared with her on television and podcasts to shed light on her journey. On the other hand, he's faced criticism for some of the things he's chosen to shine a spotlight on. Mantegna is a proud gun owner and avid firearms enthusiast. He even spent time hosting a cable show called Gun Stories, spotlighting the latest weapons on the market. In 2015, He even donated 2 of his prized rifles for an auction raising funds for the Friends of the Israeli Defense Force. So I think that's a slightly fitting note to end this overlook on. I'll hold my hands up. I do not and will not ever understand this obsession that many people have with guns. Over the course of this podcast, I'm getting to learn a bit more about some of these individuals, people that I maybe didn't know too much about beforehand. His story is quite interesting and textured, but something obviously agitate me on a personal level. We can't like everything everyone does all the time. We can't blindly agree with everything they do. So where can you and where do you draw the line as to what you will and won't accept from your entertainers? Full transparency, the gun issue and the raising of funds for the IDF is problematic for me. But this show isn't an endorsement of anyone who appears on it. It's an education. I'm recording this section before we get to the film of the day, Homicide, and based on what little I know of the plot, I think we might need to carry on this conversation in a bit more depth shortly. What does excite me about Mantegna is his long-term collaboration with Mamet. I adore Glengarry Glen Ross, did I mention that? And from the limited amount of films I've seen of Mantegna, I'm also a fan of his acting style, so I'm really keen to see how these two work together. I don't think it's unfair to say that when it comes to the big screen, Mantegna is a bit of a jobbing actor. He goes from paid gig to paid gig as long as the material feels right for him. He's a household name in a way, but he could walk down the street unrecognised most days of the week. And if I was ever going to aspire to any level of fame, it would probably be his. So then, let's see how the prickly subject matter of 1991's Homicide sits alongside my admiration for Mamet and my new understanding of Mantegna.
Robert Gold is a detective.
I need you to go out there, find this man, and bring him in alive.
We tail him, we nail him, we turn him over, we shake him.
Let's go get him.
How come you always gotta be the first one through the door?
Our job is to bring him down alive. We're the garbage men. You think I don't know that?
Robert Gold is a Jew.
I'm sorry, Bobby. I got a call downtown. The Jewish guys, they got this clout. You were there, you're his people, you're on the case.
I'm his people?
You hate yourself that much. You belong nowhere.
He's about to be presented with some difficult choices.
Would you like to know how to solve the problem of evil?
No, man. Because if I did, then I'd be out of a job.
1991's Homicide, written and directed by David Mamet, starring Joe Mantegna, William H. Macy, Rebecca Pidgeon, and Ving Rhames. So, in the process of watching this film and doing a little digging into it, I've learned that Mamet, who I waxed lyrical about just mere moments ago, is a staunch conservative. He really loves Trump. He's very pro-Israel in the light of the current conflict. He's very homophobic. He's very racist. And he's absolutely a defender of guns. He loves guns. So him and Joe get on quite well. Here we are again, Glengarry Glen Ross, but on the streets and in a TV movie. This is a TV movie. Mamet directed it. He wrote it. It really has a TV movie aesthetic. But it also has that Mamet magic. It has the crackling dialogue, or at least it seems to. On the page, it certainly does. I'm not convinced 80% of the actors in this film can deliver it. It feels garbled in their mouths. I'll talk about Mantegna's capabilities with Mamet's dialogue, but I feel like the supporting cast really haven't got the handle on it. It feels like a lot of them are pausing, saying their line, pausing, letting the next person say their line. That crackerjack, whip fast dialogue is sort of lost in the telling because the cast aren't quite capable of delivering it. The film is very rugged, it's very dirty, it's very shadowy, it's very cramped, and if that was intentional by Mamet, then great. But the story is very disjointed. It's compelling, but it's disjointed. On the one hand, we have this tale of Mantegna's character who is trying to track down a drug dealer who escaped an early bust in the film. So we have this one case on the side, which is simply a police procedural where he's trying to track this guy down. And he tries to do that by going through his brother and his mother, and we see him in his role as a hostage negotiator relating to these people, trying to find this guy. At the same time, we have this very existential, meditative journey of his Jewishness when he discovers that a convenience store woman in the town, in the city, was gunned down. The immediate family and people around her that seem to swarm around after her death are Zionists. They're a Zionist group, and he quickly discovers that this old lady was involved in the arms trade, getting guns into Israel and passing them around other Zionist entities. The way the film balances these two storylines makes it tricky and prickly, because on the one hand you have a fairly straightforward cop/detective story. On the other hand, you have a story of this man who is Jewish but doesn't identify himself as such, and the events of the film force him to look internally, force him to research his own history, force him to look beyond what he might otherwise look at, and challenge his own stereotypes which have been ingrained in him because of the abuse and the name-calling that he's been subjected to as a member of the Jewish community. He's always let it bounce off him. When he's been called some of the unsavory anti-Semitic names, he's never really reacted. It's just been part of the job, even from his colleagues. But he's given cause to reflect. Why am I always the first one through the door when we're doing a drugs bust? Why am I the one that they choose to be a hostage negotiator? Because they think I'm like these bad guys. These things are interesting. But while watching the film, I had to wrestle with the reality that I know that Joe Mantegna raises money for the Israeli Defense Force. I have to wrestle with the knowledge that Mamet is very pro-Israel. So when you have Zionist characters in a film like this, are you sympathetic or are you objective in the portrayal? And that's what's halfway fascinating about the telling of this story, because when the Zionist characters are introduced, Mantegna's character is the one who embodies us as an audience. Certainly me as an audience member. When they start talking about the rationale and the reasons for why this old woman may have died, he's cautious. A few calls are made by the Zionists saying someone was shooting at us from the rough. Great bit of Mamet dialogue. There was a shooter on the rough. How do you know he was on the rough? The Americans say roof as rough. I don't know why. That tickles me. Mantegna isn't sure whether he believes them. And then these people say to him, oh, right, us Jewish are always lying, right? It's always a coincidence. There's always something else. It's never because we're Jewish. And that is interesting to look at as a concept, because for sure there would have been many, many times, and still will be times, when communities, not just Jewish communities, any community who's felt persecuted or oppressed will feel like their legitimate concerns aren't being listened to, aren't being taken seriously. But what happens in this film is it takes it up a notch. The introduction of guns, the introduction of this underground Zionist network that is operating in this unnamed city, and Joe Mantegna's character, Bobby Gold, having to navigate his place between the police force and his ancestry is intriguing. He very quickly goes down a route, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but he very quickly goes from a man who doesn't allow himself to be pigeonholed by his Jewishness to a man who wants to find out more about Israel and what he can do for the Israeli people. And it's really hard, my stance, how I view things, to watch the portrayal of the Zionist characters in this film get conflated with Jewish people, because we have extremists at play in this film. We have Zionists and we have Nazis. Sometimes when bad things happen in this film, rather than it being assigned to a grey area, it's assigned to Nazis did it. So, okay, we must be sympathetic to the Jewish plight, the Jewish cause, of course. But then when the Zionists are talking about getting guns into Palestine, taking guns to Palestine, are we meant to sympathise with these people? It's a tricky film to navigate, because until the very last moments, I didn't know where the filmmaker's intent landed. I tried to eliminate what I knew about Mamet and just focus on what the story was telling us. And all told, I have to say, by the end, there is a great level of complexity and layering there, which says not everything you've seen is to be believed. Not everything you see can be easily packaged up. It's intriguing. It's a very different watch in the 21st century, particularly given what's happened over the last couple of years, or at least let's say what's gone into the headlines in the last couple of years. So my feelings on the film are, it's a challenging watch, a frustrating watch at times, but given Mamet's dialogue and given Mantegna's ability to navigate it, it's worth your time.
He's got no call to question my loyalty.
How's your head?
He had no fucking call to get racialized.
So he called you one, you called him one. We get to the gym.
Son of a bitch is gonna go.
Yeah, I feel it too.
Piece of cake.
Either a piece of cake or a slice of life. You notice that?
Yeah, I've remarked that. Ain't that the truth?
That is the truth.
We could have brought the son of a bitch in with a knock on the door.
Well, let's go bring him in then.
That's right.
Garner some of them kudos and all that they got.
That's right. FBI, man.
That's right.
FBI could fuck up a baked potato.
FBI couldn't find Joe Louis in a bowl of rice. You know what's needed here?
What, Sully?
Police work.
Yeah. Some of that police work that people talk about.
On to Joe Mantegna himself in this. As I say, he's the only one in this cast who's handling Mamet's dialogue, but not completely convincingly, I have to say. He's still quite staid and stilted. I listened to an interview with him where he said that Mamet is very much a case of, this is the dialogue, I've written the character, you just say the lines. You say the lines. Don't try and create the character beyond the lines that are on the paper. And that very much feels like what Mantegna's done here. He's brought his acting chops, of course, but it really feels to me like he is just saying Mamet's lines. It feels like he's reading a script at times. The script is very good, and he's the most capable of all the cast to deliver it, but I'm still not sure it's a completely compelling and convincing performance from him. He plays it quite low energy and calm at the beginning. He plays a character who's sort of shit upon a little bit. He gets hit over the head and he turns the other cheek. He seems like a nice guy, and all of that will come to bear fruit by the end of the film. We see what has become of the man who keeps turning his cheek, what he does, the lengths he goes to. One of the lengths he goes to is setting off a bomb. His connection, Joe Mantegna plays quite an interesting character in that he's put upon, he's beaten down a little bit, but he still does stand up for himself, but not very much. And he's used as the navigator in the community. He's used to speak to the Jewish people in the community. He's used to speak to the black people in the community. Because, as he puts it, the rest of the police force think that they're bad guys. They still see me as a bad guy because I'm Jewish. So they put me in those situations. And it's interesting to see him portray this character. He is playing a conflicted character because although he is Jewish, he doesn't like to think that his Jewishness defines him. He doesn't really like to think that he's being looked at a certain way because he is Jewish. And he plays it quite well, as particularly when he starts trying to discover things a little bit more about his Jewish ancestry. It's when it broaches Zionism where it becomes uncomfortable for me, because I feel there is a point in the movie where he suddenly jumps aboard the Zionist ship. You'll have to see the film to see exactly how that pans out, because it isn't a case of converting someone to an extremist way of thinking. There's a slightly more nuance than that, but I don't think it's been delivered very well in the film. It's a bit of a cop-out that his delving into Zionism has to be paralleled with Nazism in the film. I think we could have done without that, and I think it feels like an easy way out to focus on Zionist people by showing the absolute extreme of the other end. At the end of the day, he is a pawn in this game, but not master manipulators above him. He's destined to be this pawn because he's not able to define himself. He doesn't know whether he is a cop who's just going to bring down justice or whether he is a Jewish man. And I guess that explains the messiness of the two conflated, the two plot points. It's a tricky film. It's a prickly film. It's not a very well made film anyway, but the fact that it attempts to deal with these subject matters is quite interesting to me. It's handled relatively well given the politics of the writer behind the scenes, but it's not a great film. It's a pretty good Joe Mantegna performance. Joe Mantegna does play it calm all the way through. He doesn't blow up. There aren't any extravagant pieces of acting. There aren't any bombastic scenes from him. He plays a man grappling with his soul and his journey. It's interesting that we've just done 2 weeks back-to-back between Beau is Afraid and Homicide, where we're looking at what could be said to be a uniquely Jewish experience. Two very different ways of exploring the story and identity. I certainly preferred Beau is Afraid to Homicide, but I admire the fact that there was at least an attempt to explore the complexities of Jewishness, Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and everything in between. So Joe Mantegna, this is, for everything I've seen you in, probably your most complex role, even though you didn't necessarily convince me that you were a standout actor. A few bits of trivia on it. The film was an adaptation. Mamet tried to adapt his friend's novel called Suspects, but the more Mamet wrote it, he realised he was just creating his own beast, so he completely left the source material behind and it became an original screenplay. Rebecca Pidgeon, who plays Miss Klein, one of the Zionists in the film, is actually David Mamet's wife. The two tied the knot on the 22nd of September in 1991, and this was their first movie collaboration together. William H. Macy, who I didn't even really talk about, he was very oddly cast in this film. He was another one of those cast members who was saying dialogue that really didn't fit. It just didn't sound right coming out of his mouth. This was another collaboration between Mantegna and William H. Macy, who have collaborated on 3 Mamet productions in addition to this: Edmund, Things Change, and House of Games. It's hard to find too much information from Joe Mantegna talking about his experience on Homicide, but I did find quite a lengthy interview with him, which I'll include in the show notes. It's mainly him discussing the experience of working with Mamet, and overall his comments are quite guarded on how he feels about the film, but it may be of interest to you.
I just really feel the need to make a connection.
Well, Niles, I think you've made a connection. It just seems a little bit extreme, though, you know?
So then, that was a bit of a heavy episode. Sorry, folks. I hope it didn't feel too heavy. I can't control these things. I don't know until I start researching these subjects in the films. I don't know what I'm going to turn up until I start digging up the information for you all. I hope it wasn't too heavy. Let's close today with the Crane connection, shall we? A little bit of fun. This is the part of the show where we try to link everything back to the episode of Frasier that we watched. Specifically, if you can remember when we were having a good time at the beginning of the episode talking about Frasier. Anyway, specifically, this is where we try to link Bobby Gold from Homicide to Derek Mann from I Hate Frasier Crane. Now, this is a tricky one because Bobby Gold, as we've surmised, largely doesn't know where he fits in. Between the blue of the badge and his Jewish heritage, he falls somewhere in the middle. When he does swing a punch, he misses. And when he does take a stand, it backfires. Derek Mann, on the other hand, is a man who very much knows who he is and what he wants. When he swings a punch, it connects. So the two are quite different. Where they're similar, though, is that when challenged, when backed up against the wall by people, they do respond. They react. They explode. Maybe Derek Mann talks the talk, but it was Bobby Gold who walked the walk when he sets off the bomb in Homicide. Mann is a man of principle. Gold is a man finding out what his principles are. Somewhere in the middle they meet. So in the end, perhaps what connects them is their inability to land a punch when standing up for what they believe is right. And again, we come to the end. At last, you say. We say goodbye to Frasier and his narrow escape from a beating. We say goodbye to Derek Mann and leave him to his newspaper column musings. Goodbye to Homicide, the prickliest of films we've covered on the show so far. Goodbye to Joe Mantegna, fascinating character study where the grey areas and the complexities of the human condition are embodied not just by him, the man himself, but by the work he chooses. And finally, as always, thank you to you, dear listeners. Really appreciate you listening. If you want to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, don't forget to follow, like, subscribe to Frasier on Film on whatever podcast platform you've got. You can connect with me online on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook using @FrasierOnFilm. And you can get in touch via email using FrasierOnFilm@gmail.com. Don't forget, folks, if you're enjoying this, please do leave me a 5-star review. Make sure it's 5 stars. If it's a 1-star review, maybe don't leave me that review. That's okay. But please do it. Do it on Apple Podcasts. That'll be very helpful for me. Next week's episode of Frasier is Here's Looking at You, where Martin gets more than he bargained for while staring down the lens of a telescope. Our guest actor is Jeff Daniels, a familiar face to almost all of you, I'm sure. But we won't be playing dumb for that episode. Instead, we'll be travelling back to 1990 and getting creepy. It's Arachnophobia Week. Thank you.